I swear you work too hard. Janice's voice floated from behind as she massaged George's shoulders. He sat at the dining table, eyes glued to the spreadsheet on his laptop screen. His muscles tensed, his mind racing with numbers, deadlines, and the weight of endless responsibilities. George chuckled softly and leaned back in his chair, looking up at her with a tired smile. Got to keep the bills paid, babe. Just a few more minutes, and then I'm all yours. Janice's tone had a playful edge, but something about it felt different this time. She slid her hand down his arm, then abruptly let go and walked toward the kitchen. Just making sure we stay on top of things, George said, stretching his back and cracking his knuckles. He glanced at the clock on his laptop. 6 p.m. dinner wasn't far off. Janice paused by the fridge, pulling out a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. George, don't forget, Mom's coming for dinner tonight, she mentioned casually. Her back turned to him as she uncorked the bottle with practiced ease. George raised an eyebrow at the mention of her mother, Deborah. That woman was never a welcomed guest in their house. Not because of her sharp tongue or judgmental glances. George could deal with that. It was more because of the way she seemed to whisper poison into Janice's ears, always planting seeds of doubt about their marriage. George had learned to navigate those tense dinners, keeping his head down and his responses polite, but it always left him drained. Your mom's coming. His voice was calm, but inside, he felt that familiar flicker of unease. Yeah. Janice poured the wine into 2 glasses, turning around with a sly smile. And one of my friends might join too. George's brow furrowed slightly, but he kept his tone light. Your friends for dinner with your mom? He chuckled nervously, trying to push away the strange sense of discomfort rising in him. You're sure that's a good idea? Janice handed him a glass of wine and leaned against the counter. Trust me, she said, taking a sip from her own glass. You like my friend. Her smile lingered just a little too long, and George noticed the way her eyes glinted. There was something behind them he couldn't quite place. She had been acting off for a while, distant at times and then overly affectionate at others. He figured it was just stress. Work had been hard on both of them. George had been putting in extra hours to make sure everything ran smoothly, but it was starting to take a toll. I'm sure I will, George replied, trying to dismiss the growing anxiety in his gut. He took a sip of the wine and returned to his laptop, but his focus was gone. He kept glancing at Janice, who had now retreated to the couch with her phone. Every few minutes, her fingers danced across the screen as if she were texting someone. Every time the phone buzzed, she smiled, one of those secretive smiles that set George on edge. Who are you texting? He asked, trying to sound casual. Just some friends, Janice answered without looking up. Nothing important. George frowned slightly but said nothing. He didn't want to be the paranoid husband. Janice had always been independent, and he respected that, but tonight something was different. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was an edge in the air, an almost imperceptible shift in the energy of their home. As the minutes ticked by, George finished his work and closed the laptop with a sense of relief. He stood and stretched, rolling his shoulders to release the tension. He glanced at Janice, who was still lost in her phone, before heading to the kitchen to check on dinner. What time is your mom coming? George asked, opening the oven to check on the roast. In about an hour, I think, Janice said, her voice distant as she typed on her phone. George turned to her, wiping his hands on a towel. And your friend, who is it anyway? Janice looked up from her phone, that same sly smile returning. Just someone I think you'll find interesting. She didn't elaborate. Before George could press further, the doorbell rang. That can't be them already, George said, glancing at the clock. It was only 6:30. Janice stood up quickly, her phone slipping in her back pocket. I'll get it. I think it's Mom. As the evening wore on, George moved quietly in the kitchen, setting the final touches on dinner. He had always taken pride in making these family meals special. It didn't matter how tired he was or how tough things got between him and Janice. This was his way of showing he still cared, still fought for their marriage. The roast was perfectly seasoned, the vegetables steamed just right, and he was putting the wine on the table when the doorbell rang. "I'll get it," Janice's voice called out sharply from the kitchen. Her tone was casual, even cheerful, but something in it made George uneasy. She had been acting strange all evening, and the presence of her friend Alfred still nodded in George's mind as Janice headed to the door. George wiped his hands on a dish towel, staring at the perfectly set table. He tried to shake the feeling that had been building in his gut, but the voices that drifted in from the hallway only deepened his unease. Laughter, unfamiliar masculine laughter, reached his ears, and it wasn't Alfred. His pulse quickened as he walked to the dining room to see what was going on. "George, come meet my friend Janice." Her voice floated into the room, the same tenseness in her tone that he had heard earlier. When George stepped into the dining room, he froze. His eyes fell on Deborah, Janice's mother, seated at the head of the table with a smug look on her face. But beside her, leaning back in a chair like he owned the place, was a man George had never seen before. The guy was tall, muscular, and carried himself with an air of arrogance. He wore a tight-fitting black shirt and expensive-looking jeans. His hair slicked back in that effortlessly cool way that immediately made George feel inadequate. The man's arm was draped lazily around Janice's waist as she stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, like they were a couple. "George, this is Alfred," Janice said, her voice overly cheerful. She gestured toward the man with a grin. "He'll be joining us tonight." Alfred flashed a cocky smile and extended a hand. "I've heard a lot about you," he said. George stood there, frozen for a second, his mind spinning. Who the hell was this guy, and why did Janice think it was okay to bring him here without telling him? He forced a polite smile and shook Alfred's hand. "Nice to meet you, Alfred," he said, his tone measured and careful. But inside, he felt that gnawing sense of unease growing. "Jesse told me all about your work ethic," Alfred said, his grip a little too firm. "I respect a guy who works hard." His smile was laced with condescension, as if he were mocking George beneath the pleasantries. "Yeah, well, somebody's got to keep the lights on," George replied, pulling his hand back and stuffing it into his pocket. He shot a quick glance at Janice, who was standing too close to Alfred for his liking. The way she looked at him, the way she laughed at whatever joke he had just whispered, it all felt wrong. George cleared his throat. So how do you two know each other?" He tried to keep his voice steady, but the tension in the room was palpable now. Janice shot him a glance, almost as if daring him to ask more questions. "Oh, Alfred and I go way back." She waved a hand dismissively, taking a seat on the couch. "We ran into each other recently, and I thought it'd be fun to have him over." George stood there for a moment, trying to process everything. Janice had never mentioned this guy before, and the way they interacted, it wasn't friendly, it was intimate. Alfred smirked, taking a seat beside Janice, a little too close for comfort. He leaned back, his arm resting casually along the back of the couch, nearly touching her shoulders. "Yeah, Janice and I have been catching up on old times. She's been telling me about the fun you two have." He winked, and Janice giggled. George's stomach turned. What the hell was going on? He felt like an outsider in his own home, watching his wife flirt with a man who clearly had no respect for boundaries. Before George could respond, Deborah let out a cold laugh from the other side of the table. "Janice, darling, isn't it about time you told him the truth?" George turned his gaze toward Janice, trying to ignore the tightness in his chest. "What's going on?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Janice exchanged a look with her mother, a cruel smile spreading across her face. "Mom's right, George," she said, her voice low but cutting. She placed her hand on Alfred's chest and looked at George with a mixture of pity and disdain. "It's time you knew the truth. You're a loser." George's heart skipped a beat, his breath catching in his throat. He took a step closer to Janice, his eyes searching hers, hoping this was some twisted joke. "What the hell are you talking about, Janice?" Janice's smile widened, her eyes gleaming with malice. "Oh, come on, George, don't act surprised. You really think I've been happy all these years?" She stepped away from Alfred, crossing her arms and staring at George with cold contempt. You work yourself to death, thinking you're doing me some kind of favor, but I don't need you. I've never needed you. You're just convenient. She laughed bitterly, looking at her mother for approval. I've been with Alfred for months now. He's everything you're not, strong, dominant, a real man. George's chest tightened as the words hit him like a punch to the gut. Months. His mind reeled as he tried to comprehend what Janice was saying. His world was unraveling in front of him. Janice, you don't mean this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands trembled at his sides, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if it was anger or heartbreak causing it. Oh, I do, Janice replied, her voice dripping with venom. She turned to Alfred, her lips curling into a smirk. And Mom's been telling me for ages to leave you, but I figured, why not have the best of both worlds? Alfred gives me everything you can, especially in bed. She giggled, and Alfred grinned. George felt his blood run cold as Janice's words sank in. He looked from her to Alfred, his mind racing, disbelief and fury warring within him. Tell him, baby, Janice teased, nudging Alfred playfully. Alfred chuckled, his eyes locking with George's in a challenge. Yeah, George, hate to break it to you, but I've been satisfying your wife in ways you never could. George's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms as Alfred's smirk widened. In fact, every time you were out there working hard, I was here taking care of things. Alfred winked, leaning back in his chair like he had won some kind of twisted game. George's vision blurred with rage. He wanted to hit Alfred, to wipe that smug grin off his face, to yell at Janice for betraying him so cruelly. But instead, he stood there, his fist shaking, his heart pounding in his chest. Every part of him screamed to lash out, but he knew better. Violence wasn't the answer, not here, not now. Deborah's voice cut through the tension like a knife. You've always been such a fool, George, she said, sipping her wine with a satisfied smirk. I warned Janice not to settle for a man like you. You were always too weak, too small-minded. She glanced at Alfred approvingly. Now, this is the kind of man Janice deserves. George's jaw clenched so tightly he thought his teeth might crack. He turned to Janice, his eyes burning with hurt and anger. You really believe this, Janice? He asked. Janice met his gaze without flinching. I do, she said coldly. You're nothing to me now, George. You were just a stepping stone. Alfred's my future. Alfred snorted, taking a sip of wine. Yeah, George, get used to it. I'm the one calling the shots now. He leaned forward, his tone condescending. You should have seen the signs, buddy. Your wife's been begging for a real man, and now she's got one. George stood there, the weight of the betrayal crashing down on him. But instead of crumbling, something shifted inside him, a calm, dangerous clarity. He glanced at Alfred, then at Janice, his face betraying nothing. The room had gone deadly quiet after the chaos that erupted moments ago, but the tension was thick. Alfred sat slumped in his chair, wiping at his scorched, tomato-splattered face, gasping for air. Janice, shaken but still fuming, stood behind him, her hands shaking as she reached for a towel. And then there was Deborah, remaining seated with her wineglass in hand, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of amusement and contempt. George stopped at the head of the table, his eyes scanning the room for a moment. He just stood there, unmoved, his expression cold and unreadable. Well, dumbass, George said quietly, his voice laced with venom. Welcome to the family. I hope you both enjoy your last dinner together. Alfred, still recovering from the scalding soup, didn't have time to react before anyone could stop him. George moved with lightning speed, grabbing Alfred by the back of the neck, his fingers digging into the man's skin and shoving his face back into the steaming bowl of tomato soup that sat on the table. The red liquid splashed in every direction as Alfred's muffled screams filled the room. His arms flailed helplessly, trying to push George away, but George's grip was unrelenting. Alfred screamed, flailing as the scalding soup burned his face. Janice let out a shocked gasp, and Deborah's wine glass clattered to the floor as she jumped back from the table. What the? George! Janice screamed, her voice a shrill mix of fear and outrage. She rushed forward, but George's next move was just as swift. George released Alfred, who fell back, gasping and choking. His face beat red and blistered. Without pausing, George turned toward Janice, his eyes narrowing. You think you can just laugh at me? Call me a loser in my own home? George growled. He reached out, grabbing Janice by the wrist as she tried to step back, but there was no escape. In one fluid motion, he twisted her arm and shoved her face into the same bowl of soup. Her screams were drowned out by the thick liquid. She kicked and struggled, her hands grasping at anything she could reach, but George was stronger. You son of a... Janice yelled as George finally let go. Her face dripping with soup, her eyes wide with rage and shock. Deborah witnessed her daughter's humiliation. Her face twisted with anger, but even in this moment, she seemed more of Ed than afraid. You've lost your mind, Deborah screeched, stepping toward George. How dare you? You're pathetic, always have been. George, breathing heavily, turned toward Deborah, his lips curling into a dangerous smile. The anger he'd been holding in for so long was starting to leak out, piece by piece, like water from a crack in a dam. George asked, his voice deceptively calm. You think I've lost my mind? You've been poisoning her against me from the beginning, Deborah. He took a step toward her, and for the first time, a flicker of fear crossed her face. You've been whispering in her ear, telling her to leave me, waiting for me to fail. His voice was growing louder now, and Janice flinched behind him. Well, guess what? I'm done with all of you. Deborah opened her mouth to retort, but George cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. Enough! He snapped, his tone brooking no argument. You think you can humiliate me, use me, and walk away and scathe? You think I'm just going to let this slide? Think again, Janice. Now wiping soup from her face, Janice tried to stand tall, her defiance momentarily broken, but she couldn't hold back. You're insane, George. You think this changes anything? You think hurting us makes you some kind of hero? Look at you, you're a joke. George didn't respond right away. He merely stared at her, his gaze hard and calculating. For the first time that night, Janice began to realize just how deep his anger ran. Alfred, now half collapsed in his chair, whimpered as he touched his blistered face, but neither George nor Janice paid him any attention. You don't get it, do you? George said quietly, his voice taking on a chilling calm. I'm not trying to be a hero. I don't care what you think of me anymore. You've already made your choice. You threw away our marriage for this. He gestured to Alfred, who groaned pathetically in his seat. Alfred was in no condition to defend himself, his ego as bruised as his face. Janice's eyes flickered between them, but the rage burning inside her wouldn't let her back down. You were never enough, George. Janice spat, her voice trembling with anger. You'll never be enough. Not for me, not for anyone. I was gonna leave you anyway. Upset. Alfred is a real man. Not some sad, overworked loser like you. Deborah nodded in agreement. Her lips curled into a sneer. She's right, George. You've always been beneath her. You can't provide for her the way a real man can. You can't give her what she deserves. George's eyes darkened as he turned his full attention to Deborah. His lips curled into a cold, dangerous smile, and he took a slow, deliberate step toward her. In you, he said softly, his voice steady but menacing. You've been waiting for this moment, haven't you? You've been feeding her lies, telling her she deserves better, telling her I'm a loser. He stopped just inches from her, his eyes locking on to hers. Well, Deborah, I've got news for you. The only losers here are you and your daughter. Deborah recoiled slightly, her bravado faltering. Don't you dare talk to me like that, she hissed. You're nothing. George. She didn't let her finish. He slammed his hand down on the table, the sound echoing through the room, silencing everyone. You've taken enough from me, George said, his voice steady and cold. Now I'm taking something back. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope, tossing it onto the table in front of Janice. Janice stared at the envelope, confused. "What's this?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Divorce papers," George replied flatly. "I've already signed them. You've lost everything, Janice. You want to be with him, fine. But you're not getting a single cent from me, not after what you've done." Janice's face paled. She ripped open the envelope and scanned the papers inside, her hands shaking. "You can't do this," she shouted, her voice desperate. "You can't just leave me with nothing." George smiled coldly. "Watch me." Alfred groaned from his seat, his voice weak. "You can't just shut up, Alfred," George barked, not even bothering to look at him. "You're done, both of you. You've made your bed now." Lying there, Deborah stood stunned in silence as George turned his back on them and walked toward the door. "Where are you going?" Janice demanded, her voice trembling with panic. George paused, his hand on the door handle. "Away from all of you," he said simply. "You've taken enough of my life. Now I'm getting it back." And with that, he walked out, leaving behind the wreckage of what used to be his family. George's world changed in a matter of days after the incident, but it wasn't chaos for him. It was control. He had spent years buried under the weight of a marriage poisoned by deceit and manipulation, but now every action he took was deliberate. He wasn't acting out of rage anymore. He was cool, methodical, calculating. His revenge wouldn't be a single explosive moment. It would be a slow, crushing process. It began with the paperwork. "I want the divorce finalized as quickly as possible," George said to his lawyer over the phone. "I don't care about dragging this out. I just want it done, and I want her left with nothing." "We'll move forward swiftly, George," the lawyer assured him. "Based on what you've told me, and with the evidence you've gathered, it should be a straightforward case." George had kept every message, every financial document. Janice's affair and her attempts to drain their joint accounts were all neatly compiled. His legal team worked fast, and within days Janice was served with the papers. Meanwhile, George made sure the news of Janice's betrayal spread like wildfire through their social circles. It wasn't hard. He posted nothing himself, but the story of what happened at that disastrous dinner party made its way around town through whispers and gossip. It wasn't long before friends, family, and even colleagues knew the details of Janice's affair with Alfred, the man with a 12-inch bravado, who it turned out had nothing else going for him. Janice's phone buzzed endlessly those first few days after the dinner, but the messages weren't the supportive kind she was used to receiving. Friends who had once flocked to her parties now distanced themselves, shocked by the revelations. Some were disgusted by her callousness, others by the fact that she bragged about using George for his money. Her social circle shrank rapidly. "I thought you were better than this, Janice," one of her closest friends texted her. "I don't know what happened to you. I can't believe you'd do that to George, of all people." "I think we need some space," another said. Janice tried to defend herself, but her attempts to regain sympathy fell flat. The image she had cultivated for years of being the perfect wife, the social butterfly, crumbled faster than she could salvage it. "How could they turn on me like this?" Janice fumed one evening as she paced through their now empty house. She'd long stopped expecting Alfred to show up for support after the dinner. He had gone dark, ignoring her calls and messages. He'd vanished completely. "You can't just leave me. Answer your damn phone." Janice screamed into her phone, tossing it onto the couch after another rejected call. Alfred was gone, and she was alone in the house that had once felt like her domain. But it wasn't her house anymore, not for much longer. George had anticipated Janice's every move. He cut off access to their joint accounts the moment the divorce papers were filed. He stopped paying her credit cards, left the bills in her name, and withdrew his support entirely. Within days, the reality of her financial situation hit her like a ton of bricks. "George can't do this," Janice muttered to herself as she went over her now empty accounts. "There's got to be some loophole," but there wasn't. George had made sure of it. Everything she thought she had was legally protected under his name, leaving her scrambling. Deborah wasn't any better off. George had spent years quietly funding her lavish lifestyle, paying her rent, covering her expenses, and tolerating her presence, only for Janice's sake. Now that obligation was gone, George cut off every financial tie to Deborah, watching her sink into the mess she created. One day, Deborah called George, her tone sweet, trying to reason with him. "George, darling, this has all been a misunderstanding. You know Janice wasn't serious. Let's work this out like adults." George, sitting in his new, smaller but comfortable apartment, barely suppressed a laugh. He let her ramble for a few minutes before cutting in. "Deborah, we're done," he said bluntly. "You've been nothing but poison for years. I won't give you another cent. Find someone else to mooch off." Deborah's tone shifted instantly, her voice dripping with venom. "You'll regret this, George. You can't survive without Janice. You think you're better off without us, but you're nothing without her." "I'm already doing better," George replied calmly, hanging up on her furious tirade. It wasn't just Janice and Deborah who crumbled. Alfred, humiliated after the dinner, became the subject of ridicule. George didn't need to lift a finger for this part of his revenge. Word of the dinner incident spread quickly, and Alfred's reputation as the arrogant lover who got his face dunked in soup became the stuff of local legend. He avoided the places where he and Janice used to hang out, eventually disappearing from hearing altogether. Rumor had it that he moved out of town, unable to face the laughter and scorn that followed him everywhere. With Alfred gone, Janice's situation worsened. The bills piled up, and soon enough, she couldn't afford to keep the house. Her credit cards maxed out, and with no money left to pay the mortgage, she had no choice but to sell their home. But without George's income backing her, the proceeds from the sale barely covered her debts. In the span of weeks, the life she had so carefully curated fell apart piece by piece. George watched it all from a distance, never once offering her a lifeline. He saw the email she sent, the tearful voicemails begging for help, but they meant nothing to him now. Janice had made her choices, and now she was paying the price. In a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of her old life, Janice reached out to a few remaining friends. She threw herself at their mercy, hoping to find someone to take her in and help her rebuild. But most of them had already distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with the woman who had treated her husband so cruelly. "I'm sorry, Janice," one friend said over the phone, her voice polite but firm. "I just don't think I can help right now. I hope you figure things out, please," Janice cried. "But I have nowhere else to go." But the call had already ended. One by one, her lifelines disappeared. Meanwhile, George thrived. He had moved into a modest but comfortable apartment in the city, where he found himself surrounded by genuine friends, people who had always cared about him, not the superficial trappings of his previous life. The peace he had longed for, the calm he hadn't known existed, was finally his. He spent more time at the gym, took up new hobbies, and even started dating again. His new life wasn't flashy, but it was real. For the first time in years, George felt free from the manipulation, the lies, and the betrayal that had suffocated him for so long. One day, as he was sitting on his balcony, sipping a coffee and watching the sunset, he received an email from Janice. It was long, filled with apologies, excuses, and pleas for another chance. "I made a mistake, George. I never realized what I had until it was gone. Please, can we just talk?" George stared at the screen for a moment, the old familiar anger threatening to rise, but then he smiled. He had already moved on. He closed the email without replying, stood up, and walked back into his new life, leaving the ruins of the old one behind. Janice, Alfred, and Deborah were left to deal with the wreckage they had created. Each of them was scrambling for a way out, but George was done. He had his life back, and there was no going back. Months had passed since the fallout, and George's life had settled into a new and fulfilling routine. Gone were the sleepless nights of doubt and anger. In their place was a sense of calm that had eluded him for years. Now he sat in his new home, a modest but well-kept house nestled in a quiet neighborhood. It was nothing like the sprawling home he once shared with Janice, but it suited him perfectly. For the first time in ages, he felt at peace. He poured himself a glass of wine, swirling the deep red liquid as the light of the setting sun filtered through the window. He took a sip, savoring the taste, and leaned back in his chair, reflecting on how far he had come. The chaos of his old life was behind him, and the satisfaction of knowing that he had risen from the ashes of his marriage was almost intoxicating. "Cheers," George murmured to the empty room, raising his glass to new beginnings. As he sat there, his phone buzzed on the table beside him. George glanced at the screen, expecting the usual messages from friends or business contacts, but froze when he saw the name Janice. Her name alone was enough to stir the memories of betrayal and heartbreak, but George felt no rush of anger or bitterness now. Those feelings had long since burned out. It moved on, but curiosity got the better of him, and he tapped the message open. "George, I know I don't deserve this, but I need to talk to you. Please." It was a short message, almost desperate, as though Janice had typed it in a hurry and hit send before she could reconsider. George stared at the text for a moment, then set his phone back down without replying. He took another sip of his wine and smiled to himself. Janice was no longer his problem. In the month since the divorce, Janice's life had unraveled completely. George had heard bits and pieces from mutual acquaintances and didn't need to fill in the gaps. After Alfred disappeared, she had struggled to keep up with the mortgage on their old house. Eventually, the house went into foreclosure, and Janice was forced to move out. Rumor had it she was living in a tiny apartment on the other side of town, a far cry from the lifestyle she had once flaunted so proudly. As for her mother, Deborah, she had quickly burned through whatever savings she had left after George cut her off. The manipulative matriarch, who once sneered at George from her comfortable perch, was now living paycheck to paycheck, barely scraping by. Some poetic justice, George thought. Considering how she had pushed Janice to betray him, he didn't revel in their downfall, but neither did he pity them. They had dug their own graves, and George had simply refused to bail them out. He thought back to that fateful dinner, the moment he had dunked Alfred's face into the bowl of hot soup, and chuckled quietly to himself. It had been the spark that ignited everything, and it still felt good to think about it. The chaos that followed had been inevitable, but it had also been necessary. For too long, George had been a passive observer in his own life. Now he was finally in control. His phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. Another message from Janice. "George, I'm begging you. Just give me 5 minutes. I've lost everything." Her desperation practically dripped from the words on the screen, but George remained unmoved. He had given Janice years of his life, of his hard work, of his loyalty, and she had thrown it all away for a cheap fling with a man who disappeared the moment things got difficult. Whatever Janice was hoping to accomplish by reaching out now, it was too late. The bridge had been burned. Setting the phone to silent, George stood up and walked over to the large window in the living room. His glass of wine still in hand, he watched as the sun was almost set now, casting a golden hue across the sky. The quiet was soothing, the kind of peace he hadn't known for so long. A knock on the door interrupted the silence. George glanced at the clock. It was late, too late for casual visitors. Frowning slightly, he walked to the door and peered through the peephole. To his surprise, standing on the doorstep was Francisco, an old friend he hadn't seen in months. George quickly unlocked the door and opened it. "Francisco, man, it's been a while," George greeted him, stepping aside to let him in. Francisco nodded, looking a little haggard but happy to see George. "Yeah, it has. I'm sorry for just dropping by like this, but I needed to talk to you." "No problem at all, come on in." "Want a drink?" George asked, heading to the kitchen. "Yes, sure. Whatever you're having." Francisco followed George inside, glancing around at the new space. "Nice place. Looks like you're doing well for yourself." "Thanks," George said, pouring Francisco a glass of wine and handing it to him. "It's been a long road, but I'm in a good place now." Francisco took a sip and nodded. "I've been hearing some things about Janice." George raised an eyebrow. "Oh, what now?" Francisco looked hesitant for a moment, then said, "She's been telling people she wants to reconcile with you. Apparently, she's been talking to some mutual friends, saying she's realized what she lost and wants to make things right." George's laughter was sudden and unexpected, causing Francisco to blink in surprise. "You're serious, George?" he asked, shaking his head. She had years to make things right, and she threw it all away for a guy like Alfred. "I'm done with her, Francisco," George replied. "She can say whatever she wants. But that part of my life is over." Francisco nodded, leaning back in his chair. "I figured as much. I just thought you should know. I appreciate it, but there's nothing she can say or do to change things," George replied, taking another sip of his wine. "I've moved on. She needs to accept that." For a few moments, they sat in silence, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. Finally, Francisco broke the quiet. "You seem different," he said, studying George in a good way. "I mean, like you've really turned a corner." George smiled and nodded. "I have. It wasn't easy, but walking away from all the toxicity was the best thing I've ever done. I've rebuilt my life, and I'm better off without all the drama." "Good for you, man," Francisco said, raising his glass in a toast. "Here's to the new beginnings." George clinked his glass against Francisco's, feeling the truth of those words resonate deep inside him. His life was his own now, free from the weight of Janice's betrayal, free from the manipulation of her mother, and free from the humiliation he had endured for so long. They spent the next hour catching up, laughing over old memories, and talking about their future plans. As the night wore on and Francisco finally left, George stood at the door for a moment, watching as his friend disappeared down the street. He closed the door softly behind him, feeling a deep sense of contentment. Back in the living room, he refilled his glass one last time and returned to his seat by the window. The night had fully descended now, the sky a deep, velvety black dotted with stars. George raised his glass again, not in celebration, but in quiet recognition of everything he had survived. "To new beginnings," he whispered once more, letting the peace of the night wash over him. He had won his battle. He had triumphed over the lies, the betrayal, and the pain. Now the future was his to shape, and for the first time in a long time he was truly looking forward to it.